he lost his water, and his field had maybe 10 days left. Not 10 days to fix it, 10 days before everything in the ground started dying for good. Across the fence, his neighbor laughed. Not quietly, not politely. The kind of laugh meant to carry. The kind meant to make sure everyone knew exactly who was about to lose everything. The man's name was Walter Hayes, 60 years old, farming the same 60 acres for most of his life. Soybeans in the ground, mid-season, too late to replant, too early to harvest. Right in that narrow window where everything depends on water. And now, there wasn't any. It hadn't faded slowly, no warning, no gradual drop. One morning, the well worked. The next, it pulled air. The county had seen dry years before, but not like this. Heat sitting heavy for weeks, rain that never came, soil cracking open like it had given up holding moisture at all. The extension office sent a man. He walked the land, checked the casing, measured depth, then told Walter what he already knew. You're not reaching the water anymore. You'd have to go deeper. Another 60, maybe 80 feet. No guarantee. The number sat between them. $1,200 just to try. Walter had that money. It was also everything he had. He tried the easier path first, the reasonable one. He walked across the fence line to his neighbor. 3 wells on that property, one of them deep, strong, still producing like nothing had changed. Walter didn't ask for charity, didn't ask for a favor. He offered to buy access, fair price, whatever it took. His neighbor smiled. At first, it almost looked friendly. Then it changed. I've got my own land to think about, he said. I'm not running water to every dry field in this county. And then he laughed. That was the moment everything narrowed. No water, no help, no time left to wait. Walter stood there, received the laughter, and said nothing. Didn't argue, didn't react, just turned and walked back toward his house. From the outside, it looked like defeat. It wasn't. It was memory. This wasn't the first time water had disappeared from this land. It had happened before. Long before the wells, before the equipment, before any of the systems they depended on now. Back when the only tool that mattered was attention. Walter reached his house, stepped inside, and sat down at the kitchen table. The numbers didn't change. The outcome didn't change. Everything still pointed in one direction: failure. Unless he was right. Right about something he had been carrying for decades. Something most people would have forgotten. Something he never did. He sat there for a long time, not deciding, remembering. And when he stood up, he already knew where to drill. He didn't call anyone right away. Not the drilling company, not the county office, because this decision wasn't something he needed help making. He stepped outside, walked past the barn, and headed toward the western edge of his land. The same path he had walked every spring for most of his life. Not out of habit, not out of routine, because he had been taught to pay attention. The ground looked the same as it always did at first glance. Dry, cracked, surface telling the same story as every other field in the county. But he wasn't looking at the surface. He never had. stopped near the fence line, at a place most people would walk past without noticing anything at all. A slight bend, barely visible. A subtle change in the way the land curved as it dropped a few inches over a long stretch. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but not random either. He stepped forward, pressed his boot into the soil, felt the resistance, the weight, the way it held, just slightly different than the ground around it. Then he crouched, picked up a handful of dirt, held it, not testing it, feeling it. He had done this before. Not once, not twice, dozens of times, over years, when there was no reason to. That was the difference. He hadn't started learning when the crisis came. He had already learned it long before. He moved a few steps further, following the line, the shape, the memory of something that wasn't visible anymore. An old channel, a path water had once taken, years, decades, maybe longer, before it disappeared from the surface. But disappearance wasn't the same as absence. He stopped again. This time, he didn't look down. He knelt and placed both hands flat against the ground, just like he had been shown a lifetime ago. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't rush it. He waited, not for something dramatic, not for a sign you could point to, but for something quieter, something you only recognize if you've felt it before. The ground wasn't empty. It never was. Water didn't disappear. It moved, changed depth, changed path, but it followed structure. And that structure was still there. Still there. He stood up, looked across the field, then back down at the spot beneath his feet. No doubt, no hesitation, just recognition. That was where he would drill. Back at the house, he sat down again, picked up the phone, called the drilling company he had already spoken to days earlier. The man on the other end recognized his voice. "You ready to move forward?" "Yes," he said. "I've got the location." There was a pause on the line. "Most folks drill closer to the house," the man said. "Less pipe, less cost." Walter didn't argue, didn't explain, just gave him the distance. 400 feet from the barn, out near the fence line. Another pause, longer this time. "You sure about that?" Walter looked out the window, toward the field, toward the place he had just left. "I am," he said, because this wasn't a guess, and it wasn't hope. It was something he had been carrying with him for more than 40 years. The drilling rig arrived before sunrise. Old truck, heavy frame, the kind of machine that didn't rush and didn't pretend to. The crew stepped out quietly. No wasted movement, no unnecessary talk. They had done this enough times to know how it usually ended. Dry holes, expensive guesses, men standing nearby watching their last bit of money disappear into the ground. Walter showed them the spot, out near the fence line, farther than most people would choose, farther than made sense on paper. One of the crew looked at the distance, then back at him. You sure you don't want to be closer to the house? Less cost, less trouble. Walter shook his head. This is where it is. They didn't argue, didn't need to. The decision had already been made. Steel hit the ground and the work began. The first 30 feet went quickly. Dry soil, packed clay. Nothing unexpected. 40 feet, 50, still nothing. The sound of the machine stayed the same, steady, unchanged. Walter sat on the fence post nearby, watching. Not anxious, not impatient, just present. Because he had seen this part before. Not the machine, not the drilling, but the waiting. By midday, they reached deeper ground. The soil changed, color shifted, texture broke differently as it came up. One of the drillers glanced at the others. Didn't say anything, but the look was enough. Something was different. 60 feet, then 70. The ground resisted differently now. Less uniform, more layered. We're hitting transition, one of them said. Not good, not bad, just uncertain. Walter didn't move, didn't react, because this wasn't the depth that mattered. The crew kept going, careful, measured, each foot earned slowly. 80 feet, still nothing you could call water, only signs that something might be there further down. One of the men shut the machine down for a moment, wiped his hands, looked over at Walter. You want us to keep going? That was the question, the one that mattered, because every foot deeper meant more money, and there wasn't much left. Walter stood up, walked a few steps closer, looked down into the hole as if he could see something no one else could. Then he nodded. Keep going. The machine started again, steel driving downward, one measured strike at a time. 90 feet. The sound changed, subtle but different. The lead driller stopped, kneeling down, checking what came up from below. Gravel. Wet gravel. He looked at the others. This time he didn't hide it. We might have something. Walter didn't smile, didn't react, because might wasn't enough. They pushed deeper. 91 feet. Then everything changed. The resistance dropped, the sound opened up, and water came up fast. Cold, clean, not a trickle, not a seep, a flow. The crew moved quickly now, setting the test, measuring output, watching the numbers stabilize. 17, 18 gallons per minute, holding steady. One of the men pulled off his cap, looked over at Walter. You knew it was here, he said. Walter looked at the water, then back at the ground, and answered quietly. I didn't guess. Word didn't spread fast. Not at first. Because no one rushed to tell it. Not the crew, not the men who saw it, and not Walter. But in a place like that, stories don't need to be announced. They move the way everything else does, through conversation, through small details mentioned once, then repeated. By the next afternoon, someone had already heard. Hayes hit water, they said. Deep well. strong flow. That was enough. Not proof, not confirmation, but enough to start the question. How? Because everyone else had seen the same conditions, same drought, same dry ground, same reports from the county office, and yet one man had found water. The first person to come see it came alone, parked at the edge of the field, walked up slow, as if he wasn't sure he should be there. It was the same neighbor who had laughed. He didn't call out, didn't make a joke this time, just stood there, watching the pipe run. Clear water, steady pressure, flowing like it had always been there. Walter was near the pump, checking the line, making sure everything held. He looked up, saw who it was, and went back to his work. No reaction, no acknowledgement, nothing to say. The neighbor stepped closer, still quiet, because this wasn't the same situation anymore. There was no advantage now in being loud. After a moment, he spoke. "You drilled deep." Walter nodded. "Had to." Another pause, longer this time, the kind where something else is trying to be said but hasn't found the words yet. Finally, the neighbor looked out across the field, then back at Walter. "I didn't think you'd hit anything." Walter didn't answer, didn't need to. The water was already answering for him. The man shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, because the difference between them was clear. One had guessed, one had known. "How'd you pick the spot?" he asked. Simple question, but not a simple answer. Walter stood up, wiped his hands, and looked out toward the fence line. The same place where he had stood the day before. "I've seen it before," he said. The neighbor frowned. Didn't understand. "When?" Walter didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't about time. It was about attention. "Long time ago," he said finally. "Back when none of this was here. No wells, no equipment, just the land." The neighbor looked out again, trying to see it, trying to understand what wasn't visible anymore. But he couldn't, because he hadn't been looking back then, and he hadn't remembered. That was the difference. Not luck, not timing, memory. The neighbor nodded once, not agreement, not acceptance, just recognition that something had been missed. Before he left, he stopped for a moment and said quietly, "I was wrong." Walter didn't turn, didn't answer, because that part didn't matter anymore. The water was running, and the field wasn't going to die. The water didn't save the field in a single day. It never works that way. Not after the ground has already started to dry. Not after the plants have already begun to stress. It took time. Steady irrigation. Measured runs. Letting the soil take it back in, slowly, the way it was meant to. At first, the change was small, barely noticeable. Leaves holding a little longer, color returning, just enough to matter. Then more. The plants stopped declining, held their ground, and then they started recovering. By the end of the season, the field didn't look perfect, not like a year with good rain, not like a year without pressure, but it was alive, and it produced enough to carry forward, enough to avoid the loss that had seemed certain just weeks before. Across the fence, the story was different. The same drought, the same conditions, but no water, no recovery. The yield dropped, not all at once, but steadily, until there was no denying it. And the difference wasn't the season. It wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It was a decision made before the problem ever appeared. Because Walter hadn't figured it out that week. He hadn't discovered it during the drought. He hadn't guessed under pressure. He had known long before any of this started. 44 years earlier, he had stood on that same piece of land, younger, watching something most people would have ignored. Water moving differently, ground holding moisture just a little longer than the rest. A pattern, subtle, easy to miss, easy to forget. But he didn't forget. He carried it year after year, not because he needed it, but because he had learned to pay attention. Most people don't do that. They react when something breaks. They look for answers when they need them. And by then, it's already too late. Walter never waited that long. He learned when there was no pressure. He remembered when there was no reason to. So when the moment came, he didn't panic. He acted. Years later, someone asked him about it, how he knew where to drill, why he was so certain, why he didn't hesitate when everything pointed toward risk. Walter thought about it for a moment, then gave the same answer he always did. Because I've seen it before. That was all. No explanation, no details. Because the lesson wasn't in the explanation. It was in the way he had lived before the problem ever arrived. Most people wait until they need the answer to start looking for it. And by then, it's already too late. Walter didn't. He paid attention when no one else was. He remembered what everyone else forgot. And when everything was on the line, that made all the difference.